Billionaire was cold and distant, stopped at the traffic light, until he saw his ex-wife selling flowers with baby. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now sit back and enjoy every detail. The Seattle skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor, but Ethan Lockhart wasn't admiring the view. His steel-gray eyes were fixed on the quarterly reports spread across his mahogany desk, numbers that would make most people dizzy with their magnitude. At 36, he had built Lockhart Automotive into a billion-dollar empire, each acquisition more ruthless than the last. His assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 5 years of anticipating his every need. "The Henderson deal is ready for your signature, Mr. Lockhart. The lawyers are waiting in conference room A." Ethan's fingers drummed against the desk, a habit he developed during the divorce proceedings 20 months ago. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. His voice carried that familiar edge of authority that made grown men nervous and competitors reconsider their strategies. As she left, Ethan's gaze drifted to the empty space on his desk where a silver-framed photograph once sat. Isla had given it to him on their 2nd anniversary, a candid shot of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke during a weekend getaway to the San Juan Islands. He'd thrown it away the day the divorce papers were finalized, along with every other reminder of their 3-year marriage. The drive to Henderson Industries should have taken 25 minutes in downtown traffic, but Ethan's Tesla moved with the precision of someone who controlled every aspect of his environment. The Henderson acquisition would add another $200 million to his portfolio, a number that once would have thrilled him. Now it felt as routine as his morning coffee. At the intersection of Pine Street and 4th Avenue, the traffic light caught him. Red. Ethan's jaw tightened with impatience as pedestrians crossed in front of his car, their mundane lives playing out in slow motion. A businessman clutching his briefcase, a teenager with headphones, an elderly couple walking hand in hand. Then he saw her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. There, standing at the corner with a bundle of bright sunflowers in her arms and a baby carrier strapped to her chest, was Isla Bennett. His Isla. Except she wasn't his anymore. Hadn't been for 20 months, 3 weeks and 4 days. His heart hammered against his ribs as he took in every detail. Her honey-colored hair, once professionally styled for corporate events, was now pulled back in a simple ponytail. The designer dresses he'd bought her had been replaced by a faded denim jacket and worn jeans. But it was unmistakably her, the woman who had once shared his bed, his secrets, his life. The baby in the carrier was small, maybe 10 or 11 months old, with a pink knit hat that had slipped slightly to reveal wisps of dark hair that looked remarkably similar to his own. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The traffic light turned green, but he couldn't move. Cars began honking behind him, their impatience cutting through the fog in his mind. A man in the car behind him leaned on his horn, the sound sharp and demanding. Isla looked up at the commotion, her eyes scanning the traffic until they landed on his car. For a moment that stretched like eternity, their gazes locked through the windshield. Her green eyes that had once looked at him with love, then disappointment, then nothing at all, widened with recognition. He watched as a dozen emotions flickered across her face: surprise, fear, anger, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The baby shifted in the carrier, making a small sound that seemed to snap Isla back to reality. Without a word, without a gesture, she turned away and began walking down the sidewalk. More horns blared. The light had been green for almost 30 seconds. Ethan's hands trembled as he fumbled for the gear shift, his eyes never leaving Isla's retreating figure. She moved with purpose, her head high despite the circumstances that had clearly changed her life dramatically. As his car finally rolled forward, one question burned in his mind, refusing to be ignored. Whose baby was sleeping so peacefully against the chest of the woman he'd never stopped loving? Have you ever seen someone from your past when you least expected it, and realized that some chapters of your life might not be as closed as you thought they were? Ethan's hands shook as he pulled into the underground parking garage of his downtown office building, the concrete walls feeling more like a prison than the sanctuary they usually provided. The Henderson meeting had been a disaster. He'd signed the wrong page twice, missed 3 key negotiation points, and left $200 million on the table because his mind was elsewhere. Elsewhere. With Isla. With the baby who had dark hair like his. In the elevator ascending to his penthouse office, Ethan caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. His usually impeccable black suit was wrinkled, his tie askew. The man staring back at him looked haunted, nothing like the composed billionaire who had built an empire on calculated risks and emotional detachment. His assistant, Miranda, looked up in surprise when he walked past her desk without his usual curt nod. "Mr. Lockhart, the quarterly board meeting is in. Cancel it." The words came out harsher than intended. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. Behind the closed doors of his office, Ethan loosened his tie and moved to the wet bar in the corner. The crystal decanter of 30-year-old Macallan had been a wedding gift from Isla's father, a peace offering after months of disapproval about his daughter marrying that cold businessman. His hands trembled as he poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid. The first sip burned, but it couldn't burn away the memory that was surfacing like a painful wound. Their last real conversation, the one that had shattered everything. "I want us to start trying, Ethan." Isla had been curled up against him in their king-sized bed, her voice soft with hope. "For a baby. We've been married 3 years. We're financially stable, and I'm 30. I'm ready." He'd gone rigid beside her, every muscle in his body tensing. "We've talked about this, Isla. It's not the right time. The company is expanding into the European market. I've got the Singapore deal. There will always be another deal." The words had exploded from her with a frustration that had been building for months. "When is it ever going to be the right time for you? When you own every car company in the world? Don't be dramatic." He'd gotten up, putting distance between them as he always did when conversations became too emotional. "Children change everything. They're expensive, demanding, they would interfere with our lifestyle." "Our lifestyle?" Isla had sat up, her green eyes blazing with hurt and disbelief. "You mean your lifestyle? Your 70-hour work weeks, your business trips, your obsession with making more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. I'm building something, Isla. I'm securing our future." "What future, Ethan? A future where we're rich and alone, where we have everything except the one thing that would actually make us happy." The argument had escalated from there, harsh words thrown like weapons designed to inflict maximum damage. She'd accused him of being emotionally unavailable, of choosing money over love. He'd accused her of being naive, of not understanding the pressures of running a billion-dollar company. The fight had ended with her sleeping in the guest room. Within a week, she'd served him divorce papers. Now, standing in his office with the taste of regret coating his tongue like ash, Ethan realized he'd never asked himself the most important question: what if she'd been pregnant when she left? His phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator, a man he kept on retainer for background checks on business associates and potential security threats. Ethan's fingers hesitated over the keyboard before he typed, "I need you to find someone. Isla Bennett, formerly Isla Lockhart. Last known address was our shared residence on Queen Anne Hill. Urgent." The response came within minutes. "On it. Full report by tomorrow morning." But tomorrow felt like a lifetime away. Ethan set down his glass and walked to the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. Somewhere out there in this maze of buildings and traffic was the woman who had once promised to love him for better or worse. The woman who might be raising his child alone while he sat in his ivory tower, counting money and pretending it filled the void she'd left behind. His reflection in the window looked back at him, and for the first time in 20 months, Ethan saw what Isla had seen. A man so afraid of feeling anything that he'd pushed away the only person who'd ever tried to crack the ice around his heart. The baby's face flashed in his mind, those dark eyes that looked remarkably familiar, the way she'd been sleeping so peacefully against Isla's chest. If she was his daughter, she was almost a year old. He'd missed her first smile, her first word, her first steps. He'd missed everything that mattered while chasing things that suddenly seemed meaningless. His phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Miranda's voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Lockhart, your mother is on line 1. She says it's important." Ethan closed his eyes. His mother had called every month since the divorce, not so subtly hinting that he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Today, he wasn't sure he had the strength to pretend otherwise. As he reached for the phone, one thought consumed him entirely. If that baby was his, he was already 20 months too late to be the father she deserved. Isla's hands trembled as she fumbled with the key to her studio apartment, the weight of 11-month-old Rosie growing heavier with each passing second. The baby carrier pressed against her chest, and she could feel her daughter's warm breath through the thin fabric of her jacket. The encounter at the traffic light had left her shaken in ways she hadn't expected. The door finally gave way, revealing the cramped but spotlessly clean space she'd called home for the past 20 months. It wasn't much, A Murphy bed that doubled as a couch, a kitchenette with barely enough counter space for a coffee maker, and a corner she'd transformed into Rosie's nursery with soft pink curtains and second-hand furniture she'd painted white. "There we go, sweet girl," Isla whispered, carefully lifting Rosie from the carrier. The baby's dark eyes, so eerily similar to Ethan's, blinked sleepily as she was transferred to her crib. Those eyes had been both a blessing and a curse, a daily reminder of the man who had chosen his empire over their family. As Rosie settled into sleep, Isla moved to the small table where she'd spread tomorrow's flowers, daisies, roses, and baby's breath that needed to be arranged into bouquets before dawn. Her fingers worked automatically, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar motions while her mind replayed every second of seeing Ethan again. He'd looked exactly the same, yet completely different. The same sharp jawline, the same perfectly styled dark hair, the same expensive suit that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. But there had been something in his expression when their eyes met. A crack in that impenetrable facade she'd spent 3 years trying to break through. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who occasionally watched Rosie when Isla had to work late. "Saw you come in looking upset, honey. Everything okay?" Isla stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that she'd just seen the father of her child? The man who'd made it crystal clear that fatherhood was an inconvenience he'd never wanted? The man who'd chosen mergers over marriage, profit over parenthood? "Just a long day. Thank you for asking." She typed back, then immediately deleted it. Mrs. Chen deserved better than lies. "Saw someone from my past today. Complicated. I'll make extra dumplings tomorrow. Complicated situations require comfort food." Despite everything, Isla smiled. Mrs. Chen's solution to every problem involved food, and somehow it usually worked. The smile faded as she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. Her reflection showed a woman who'd aged more than 20 months in the time since her divorce. The stress of single motherhood had carved subtle lines around her eyes, and her honey-colored hair had lost some of its shine from drugstore shampoo instead of salon treatments. She'd been 28 when she married Ethan, full of dreams about their future together. She'd imagined Sunday mornings with children laughing in the kitchen, family vacations to places she'd only seen in magazines, growing old together surrounded by grandchildren. Instead, she'd gotten 3 years of feeling like a beautiful accessory to his success, someone to look good at charity galas and business dinners, but never truly share his life. The pregnancy test had been positive 6 weeks after she'd signed the divorce papers. She'd sat on the bathroom floor of her friend's guest room, staring at those 2 pink lines, and felt her world shift on its axis. For exactly 3 minutes, she'd considered calling him. Then she'd remembered his words. Children would interfere with our lifestyle. Her lifestyle now consisted of wake-up calls at 4:30 a.m. to arrange flowers, walks through downtown Seattle with Rosie strapped to her chest, and falling asleep to the sound of her daughter's breathing, instead of the financial network that had once provided the soundtrack to her marriage. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was theirs. Rosie stirred in her crib, making the soft cooing sounds that meant she'd be awake soon and hungry. Isla moved to the tiny refrigerator, pulling out a bottle she'd prepared earlier. As she warmed it in a pot of hot water, she couldn't afford a bottle warmer. Her mind wandered to the moment when Ethan had stepped out of his car. For just a second when their eyes met, she'd seen something she'd never seen before. Vulnerability. The great Ethan Lockhart, master of the universe, had looked lost. Almost human. Then Rosie had shifted in her arms and reality crashed back. This was the man who'd told her that having children would be financially irresponsible and emotionally draining. This was the man who'd worked 18-hour days to avoid coming home to a wife who desperately wanted to build something more meaningful than a stock portfolio. Rosie's cries grew more insistent, and Isla lifted her daughter from the crib, settling into the second-hand rocking chair that had become their nighttime sanctuary. As she fed her baby, humming a lullaby her own mother had sung to her, one thought crystallized in her mind. Ethan Lockhart had made his choice 20 months ago. He'd chosen his company over their marriage, his ambition over her dreams, his fear over love. Now she had to make hers. Protect the daughter he'd never wanted from the father who'd never been ready to love her. The private investigator's report arrived at 6:47 a.m., delivered to Ethan's penthouse via encrypted email. Marcus Vale had been thorough, as always. 12 pages of detailed findings that painted a picture Ethan wasn't prepared to see. Subject: Isla Marie Bennett, formerly Lockhart. Current address: 412. Pine Street, Apartment 3B, Seattle, WA employment, self-employed flower vendor, various downtown locations. Monthly income, estimated $800, $200 dependents. One female child, approximately 11 months old. Ethan's coffee grew cold as he read every word. Twice. The woman who had once worn designer gowns to charity galas now lived in a studio apartment that cost $600 a month. The woman who had shared his king-sized bed in their Queen Anne Hill mansion now slept on a Murphy bed that folded into the wall, but it was the final paragraph that stopped his heart entirely. Subject gave birth at Seattle General Hospital on March 15th. Birth certificate lists child as Rosemary Grace Bennett. Father, unknown. Rosemary Grace. Born exactly 9 months and 3 weeks after their last night together. The night before she'd served him with divorce papers. The night they'd made love for the final time. Desperate and angry and clinging to something that was already slipping away. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing Marcus directly. The investigator answered on the first ring. "I need more," Ethan said without preamble. "Everything. Medical records, birth records, anything you can legally access. Already on it." "But Ethan," Marcus's voice carried a warning. "The timeline fits. If this kid is yours, she's been struggling alone for almost a year. That changes things." It changed everything. By 8 a.m., Ethan was in his Tesla, driving the familiar streets of downtown Seattle with no clear destination except away from the suffocating walls of his office. He found himself taking the same route he'd driven yesterday, past the intersection where his carefully controlled world had imploded. There she was again. Isla stood at the corner of 2nd and Pike, the baby carrier secured across her chest while she arranged flowers in white plastic buckets. Even from a distance, he could see the methodical way she worked, the same precision she'd once brought to organizing his social calendar, now applied to survival. He parked 2 blocks away and walked closer, using the morning crowd as cover. The baby, Rosie, he now knew her name, was awake, her tiny hands reaching for the colorful petals while Isla sorted stems with practiced efficiency. A businessman stopped to buy a bouquet, and Ethan watched Isla's face transform as she smiled, warm and genuine in a way she'd stopped smiling at him during their final months together. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to a woman in nurse scrubs, probably coming off the night shift at the nearby hospital. "How much for the roses?" $15 for a dozen, Isla replied, her voice carrying that same musical quality that had first captivated him at a business conference 5 years ago. "They're fresh this morning." The nurse counted out crumpled bills while Rosie babbled something that sounded like mama. Ethan's chest tightened at the sound. His daughter's first word, a word he'd missed, along with everything else that mattered. "She's beautiful," the nurse said, gently touching Rosie's hand. "How old?" 11 months, Isla answered, and there was such fierce pride in her voice that it hit Ethan like a physical blow. "She's my whole world." After the nurse left, Isla began rearranging the remaining flowers, humming softly to Rosie. It was a song Ethan recognized, one she used to hum while cooking dinner in their marble kitchen, back when they'd still pretended their marriage could be saved. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. "Board meeting moved to 10 a.m. Henderson's lawyers are threatening to pull out if you don't review the contracts today." Ethan stared at the message, then at the woman who was now singing softly to the baby girl with his eyes and her smile. 20 months ago, he would have been back in his office within minutes choosing deals over everything else. Today, the very idea made him sick. He typed back, "Handle it. I'm unavailable. All day? Mr. Lockhart, this is a $200 million. I said handle it." He turned off his phone and continued watching from the shadows. A teenage boy with paint-stained fingers bought a single white rose, probably for a girl who had no idea how lucky she was. An elderly man chose daisies, mentioning something about his late wife's grave. Isla listened to each customer like their story mattered, like their $15 purchase was the most important transaction of her day. This was who she'd always been, the woman who remembered birthdays, who sent thank you cards, who asked about his secretary's sick mother, even when he couldn't be bothered to learn the woman's name. He'd been so focused on building his empire that he'd never noticed he was married to a queen. As the morning crowd thinned, Isla began packing up the unsold flowers. Rosie had fallen asleep against her chest, tiny fists curled around the fabric of her mother's worn jacket. Ethan watched them prepare to leave, these 2 females who shared his DNA but not his name, and felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd spent his entire adult life believing that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, that emotions were weaknesses to be conquered. But standing there, watching his ex-wife struggle with dignity while his daughter slept peacefully in her arms, Ethan finally understood what he'd lost. It wasn't just a marriage. It wasn't just a wife. He'd lost his family. 3 days of surveillance had taught Ethan his ex-wife's routine better than he'd ever known it during their marriage. Isla arrived at Pike Place Market at 6:30 a.m. to buy flowers wholesale, set up at 2nd and Pike by 7:45, worked until 2 p.m., then disappeared into the maze of downtown streets with their daughter. Today, he wasn't content to watch from the shadows. Ethan approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, but every prepared speech crumbled as he took in the sight of Rosie babbling happily in her carrier, tiny hands reaching for the morning sunlight filtering through the downtown canopy. Isla noticed him when he was still 10 feet away. Her entire body went rigid, protective instincts kicking in as she instinctively stepped back, putting more distance between him and the baby. Ethan. His name fell from her lips like a curse. Isla. He stopped walking, giving her space, but close enough to see the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes. We need to talk. No, we don't. Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor beneath the surface. We said everything we needed to say 20 months ago. Did we? Ethan's gaze dropped to Rosie, who was now staring at him with curious dark eyes that looked exactly like his own in childhood photographs. Because I'm pretty sure there are some important details we left out. Isla's jaw tightened. I don't know what you think you... She's mine. The words came out quieter than he'd intended, but they cut through the morning air like a blade. Rosie, she's my daughter. For a moment, the busy street around them seemed to fade into background noise. Pedestrians walked past, cars honked in the distance, but all Ethan could focus on was the way Isla's face crumpled before she rebuilt those walls he knew so well. You don't get to do this, she whispered, her green eyes blazing with a fury that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. You don't get to show up here and... I hired an investigator. The confession stopped her mid-sentence. I know when she was born. I know the timeline. I know you were alone at Seattle General when you had her. Isla's face went pale. You investigated me? I had to know. Ethan took a step closer, noting how she immediately tensed. Isla, if she's mine. If! The word exploded from her lips with such venom that several passers-by turned to stare. Rosie startled at her mother's raised voice, letting out a small whimper that made Isla immediately soften her tone. If she's yours? Look at her, Ethan. Really look at her. He did. Dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, just like his had as a child. A stubborn set to her jaw that he recognized from his own reflection. The way she gripped things with her left hand. The same preference he'd had since birth, but it was her eyes that sealed it. Not just the color, but the intensity. The way she seemed to be absorbing everything around her with fierce intelligence. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked on the question he'd been carrying for 3 sleepless nights. Isla let out a bitter laugh. Tell you? Tell the man who said children would interfere with our lifestyle? Tell the man who worked 18-hour days to avoid coming home to his wife? Tell the man who made it crystal clear that fatherhood was an inconvenience he'd never wanted? Each accusation hit him like a physical blow because they were all true. Isla, if I had known... You would have what? Suddenly become the family man you swore you'd never be? You would have given up your precious empire to change diapers and attend mommy and me classes? She shook her head, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I saved us both the disappointment. Rosie began to fuss, sensing her mother's distress. Isla immediately began swaying, making soft, shushing sounds that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. Watching her comfort their daughter, Ethan felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. I was wrong. The admission came out hoarse, like it was being dragged from somewhere deep inside him. About everything, about children, about priorities, about what matters. Don't. Isla's voice was sharp. Don't you dare stand there and tell me you've changed just because you saw us on the street. Don't you dare make this about your guilty conscience. It's not about guilt. He was lying and they both knew it. It's about my daughter. Our daughter. She's my daughter. Isla's arms tightened protectively around Rosie. You signed away any claim to her the day you chose your company over our marriage. I never signed away anything because I never knew she existed. The words came out louder than he'd intended, drawing more stares from curious onlookers. Ethan lowered his voice, but the intensity remained. You made that choice for me, Isla. You decided I wasn't worthy of being her father before I even had a chance to try. Try? Isla's laugh was hollow. You had 3 years to try, Ethan. 3 years of marriage where I begged you to let me in, to share your life, to build something more than a business partnership. You chose solitude then. Why should parenthood be any different? Because everything was different now. Because seeing them together, mother and daughter struggling but strong, had shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. Because for the first time in his life, money and power felt meaningless compared to the family he'd lost. But before he could find the words to explain, Isla was already backing away, putting more distance between them. Stay away from us, Ethan, she said, her voice breaking on his name. We don't need your guilt or your money or your sudden interest in playing father. We're doing just fine without you. As she turned to leave, Rosie looked back over her mother's shoulder, meeting Ethan's eyes with that intense stare that was so familiar it hurt. For just a moment, father and daughter looked at each other across an impossible distance. Then they were gone, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Ethan standing alone among strangers with the devastating realization that just fine was exactly what he'd never be again. Ethan's Aston Martin felt like a prison as he sat in the underground garage of his building, staring at the concrete wall ahead. The confrontation with Isla replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each word she'd spoken cutting deeper than the last. He'd destroyed the best thing in his life once, and now he was watching the consequences play out in the form of a daughter who would grow up never knowing her father. His phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past hour. Missed calls from his assistant, his board members, his mother. The Henderson deal had officially collapsed, costing him $200 million and his reputation as the unshakable king of automotive acquisitions. 6 months ago, it would have devastated him. Today he couldn't bring himself to care. There was only one call he wanted to make. Vale. The private investigator answered on the second ring. I need another favor, Ethan said, his voice hoarse from the emotional battlefield he'd just left. Legal advice. Hypothetically, what rights does a father have if paternity can be established? A long pause. Ethan, tell me you're not thinking about pursuing custody. I'm thinking about a lot of things. He leaned back against the leather headrest, closing his eyes. Just answer the question. In Washington state, biological fathers have rights to visitation, even partial custody, if they can prove paternity and demonstrate they can provide a stable environment for the child. Marcus's voice carried a warning. But given the circumstances, the mother's clear desire for no contact, the fact that you've been absent for the child's entire life, any court battle would be brutal and public. Public. The thought of Isla's private struggles being dissected in newspapers made Ethan's stomach turn. What if I just wanted to help? Financially, I mean. Child support? Better living conditions? You'd need her consent for voluntary support, or a court order for mandatory support. Both require acknowledging paternity, which means... Marcus trailed off. Which means she'd have to cooperate. Ethan finished the thought, already knowing Isla would rather live in that cramped studio apartment forever than accept a penny from him. After hanging up, Ethan found himself driving aimlessly through Seattle's familiar streets, past the coffee shops where he and Isla used to meet for lunch, past the bookstore where she'd spent Saturday afternoons reading while he worked. Every corner held a memory of the woman who had tried so desperately to break through his emotional walls, only to give up and build walls of her own. His phone rang again. This time, he answered. Ethan James Lockhart. His mother's voice carried that particular tone she'd perfected during his childhood. Equal parts disappointment and determination. Miranda told me you've been unreachable for 3 days. The Seattle Times is reporting that Henderson Industries is reconsidering their acquisition terms because you've gone AWOL. Hello, Mother. Ethan pulled into the parking lot of a small neighborhood park, watching children play on swings while their parents pushed them higher. I'm fine. You're clearly not fine. What's going on? And don't you dare tell me it's just business stress. I've known you for 36 years, and you've never missed a meeting in your life. Eleanor Lockhart had always been perceptive, a trait that had served her well during her own corporate career before she'd retired to philanthropy. There was no point in lying to her. I saw Isla, he said quietly. The silence stretched so long that Ethan wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, his mother spoke, her voice gentler than before. How is she? She has a daughter. The words felt like glass in his throat. My daughter, 11 months old. Another long pause. Oh, Ethan. She was pregnant when she left me, Mom. Pregnant and alone, and I never knew. He watched a father push his toddler on a swing, the little girl shrieking with delight as she soared higher. I have a daughter, and she doesn't even know my name. What are you going to do? It was the question that had been haunting him for 3 sleepless nights. What could he do? Isla had made her feelings crystal clear. She wanted nothing to do with him. But somewhere in this city was a little girl with his eyes and his stubbornness, growing up believing her father had abandoned her before she was even born. I don't know, he admitted. She hates me, Mom, and maybe she has every right to. Ethan, his mother's voice took on that firm tone he remembered from his teenage years. You made mistakes in your marriage, serious ones, but that doesn't mean you can't try to make amends now. She won't let me near them. Then you'll have to prove you've changed. Not with words, Isla's too smart for that, but with actions. Consistent, patient actions that show her the man you've become. What if I haven't become anything? The question came out more vulnerable than he'd intended. What if I'm still the same selfish bastard who chose profits over his pregnant wife? Are you? His mother's question was direct, challenging, because the Ethan I raised would have already figured out how to help them, even if it meant swallowing his pride and working in the shadows. After the call ended, Ethan sat in his car as darkness fell around the park. Families were heading home, fathers carrying tired children to minivans, mothers gathering forgotten toys and empty juice boxes. Normal families, doing normal things, taking for granted the everyday miracles he'd never thought he wanted. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a wild moment his heart raced, thinking it might be Isla. Instead, it was from Marcus. Thought you should know. Property records show Isla's lease is up for renewal next month. Landlord's been raising rents in that building. Might be relevant. Ethan stared at the message, pieces of a plan beginning to form in his mind. If Isla wouldn't let him help directly, perhaps there were other ways. Ways that didn't require her permission or her forgiveness. Ways that might slowly and carefully prove to the mother of his child that some people really could change, even if they'd taken 20 months too long to start trying. 2 weeks passed before Isla noticed the changes. It started small, almost imperceptibly so. The wholesale flower vendor at Pike Place Market began giving her better deals, claiming he was overstocked and needed to move inventory quickly. The elderly Korean woman who sold coffee from a cart near her usual corner started refusing payment, insisting that pretty mother with baby deserved free coffee. Even Mrs. Chen from next door had mysteriously received an anonymous grocery delivery that she'd insisted on sharing. Isla wasn't naive. She'd spent 3 years married to a man who wielded money like a weapon, who believed every problem could be solved with the right amount of cash applied in the right places. But proving Ethan's involvement was impossible when everyone insisted their generosity was either coincidence or kindness. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning when her landlord, Mr. Patterson, knocked on her door with an expression she'd never seen before, something almost resembling embarrassment. "Ms. Bennett," he said, shifting uncomfortably in the hallway. "I need to discuss your lease renewal." Isla's stomach dropped. She'd been dreading this conversation for weeks, knowing her rent was about to increase beyond what she could afford. "Mr. Patterson, if this is about the rent increase, I can try to—" "Actually, there's been a change." He handed her an official-looking document. "The building's been purchased by a property management company. They're implementing a new affordable housing initiative. Your rent is being reduced to $400 a month, with a 2-year guaranteed lease." Isla stared at the papers, her hands beginning to tremble. "I'm sorry, what? Lockhart Property Management?" He read from his own copy. "They specialize in providing stable housing for working families. Apparently, you qualify for their assistance program." The papers fell from Isla's fingers, scattering across the worn linoleum floor. Lockhart. Of course it was Lockhart. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Mr. Patterson bent to gather the scattered documents, concern creeping into his voice. "I can't accept this." The words came out strangled, fury and frustration warring in her chest. "Tell them I decline their generous offer. I'm afraid it's not really optional. The new owners have restructured all the leases in the building. Everyone qualifies for the reduced rate." He straightened, papers in hand. "It's actually quite fortunate. Most of the tenants are thrilled." After he left, Isla sank onto her Murphy bed, Rosie playing contentedly with a set of plastic measuring cups nearby. Her daughter had no idea that her world was being systematically invaded by a man who thought money could buy forgiveness, or access to the family he'd abandoned. Her phone buzzed. A text from the flower vendor. "Got a special order today. Someone wants to buy all your remaining inventory every day for the next month. paying triple rate. They want the flowers donated to Seattle General's maternity ward. Should I accept? Isla's hands shook as she typed back. Who placed the order? Anonymous benefactor. Payment came through a law firm. Very official. She closed her eyes, remembering the antiseptic smell of the maternity ward where she'd given birth alone, where she'd cried into a hospital pillow while holding Rosie for the first time, wishing desperately that someone, anyone, had been there to share the moment. Now Ethan was ensuring other women would have flowers to brighten those sterile rooms. It was thoughtful. It was generous. It was manipulation. An hour later, Isla found herself standing outside the gleaming tower that housed Lockhart Automotive, Rosie secured in her carrier, determination burning in her chest like wildfire. The security guard in the marble lobby tried to stop her, but something in her expression must have warned him not to try too hard. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal. When the doors opened, Isla stepped into a world she'd forgotten existed, all understated luxury and hushed efficiency, where the coffee cost more than she made in a day and everyone wore clothes that could feed her for a month. Ethan's assistant Miranda looked up from her computer with poorly concealed shock. Mrs. Locke, Ms. Bennett, Mr. Lockhart is in a meeting. Then get him out of it. Isla's voice carried an authority she'd learned during those 3 years as a billionaire's wife, a tone that suggested resistance would be futile. Miranda hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before reaching for her phone. Mr. Lockhart, you have a visitor. Yes, sir. Right away. The office doors opened before Miranda finished hanging up. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his usual composure cracking the moment he saw them. His eyes immediately went to Rosie, who was wide awake and curiously taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Isla, her name came out like a prayer. Don't. She walked past him into the office she'd visited so many times during their marriage, the space where he'd chosen to spend more time than in their home. Just don't. Ethan closed the door behind them, creating a bubble of privacy in the middle of his empire. I take it you received the lease renewal notice. Stop. The word exploded from her with such force that Rosie startled, her little face scrunching up in preparation for tears. Isla immediately began swaying, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more venom than any shout. Stop trying to manage my life. I'm trying to help. You're trying to control. She turned to face him, and Ethan felt his heart stop at the pain blazing in her green eyes. This is what you do, Ethan. You throw money at problems until they disappear. You buy solutions instead of earning them. What was I supposed to do? Watch you struggle when I could help? Yes. The word rang through the office like a gunshot. Yes. You were supposed to watch me struggle, because that struggle is mine. Those choices are mine. That life is mine. Ethan moved closer, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Isla, please. I just want... You want what? To ease your guilt? To play the generous benefactor so you can sleep better at night? Rosie began to fuss, responding to her mother's agitation. Isla's voice softened automatically as she comforted her daughter, but her eyes remained hard as flint. You want to be her father without earning the right. You want forgiveness without doing the work. Then tell me how to do the work. The desperation in his voice was raw, unfiltered. Tell me what I need to do to earn the right to know my daughter. Isla studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she apparently didn't find. Start by respecting my choices. Stop the anonymous gifts. Stop the property management company. Stop trying to orchestrate my life from behind the scenes. And then nothing. She moved toward the door, Rosie now calm in her arms. There is no then, Ethan. Some things can't be bought and some mistakes can't be undone with money. As she reached for the door handle, Ethan's voice stopped her. She has my hands. Isla froze, her back still to him. Her hands, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They're exactly like mine were when I was a baby. My mother showed me pictures once. The way she grabs things, the way she holds her fingers when she's thinking. It's identical. Slowly, Isla turned around. For the first time since entering his office, she looked uncertain. I know I don't deserve to be part of her life, Ethan said, taking a careful step forward. I know I've lost the right to call myself her father. But she's going to grow up, Isla. She's going to ask questions about where she came from, about why her father wasn't there. And I'll tell her the truth. Isla's voice was steady, but Ethan caught the slight tremor underneath. I'll tell her that her father had more important things to do. What if that's not the truth anymore? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Rosie chose that moment to reach toward Ethan, her small hand opening and closing in the universal baby gesture for pick me up. It lasted only a second before she turned back to her mother, but it was enough to shatter something in both their faces. "Stop the property management company," Isla whispered, her voice breaking. "Stop all of it. If you want to prove you've changed, prove it by respecting the word no." This time, when she left, Ethan didn't try to stop her, but as the elevator doors closed on the two most important people in his world, he realized that learning to respect no might be the hardest lesson he'd ever had to master. 3 weeks of silence stretched between them like an unbridgeable chasm. Ethan kept his word. The anonymous gifts stopped, the property management company dissolved, the wholesale flower deals returned to normal rates. He drove past Isla's corner every morning on his way to work, watching her from a distance but never approaching, respecting the boundaries she'd drawn in the sand. It was killing him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 3 years of marriage avoiding emotional intimacy, and now emotional distance felt like slow starvation. He threw himself into work with renewed intensity, but the numbers on his computer screen blurred into images of dark-haired babies and the woman who'd once loved him enough to try breaking down his walls. His mother called twice a day. His assistant walked on eggshells. His board members whispered about his distracted performance during meetings. Ethan heard it all from a distance, as if his real life was happening somewhere else, in a cramped studio apartment where his daughter was learning to walk without him there to catch her when she fell. The call came at 2:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mr. Lockhart?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but urgent. "This is Dr. Sarah Mills from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about your daughter, Rosemary Bennett." The world tilted sideways. Ethan's coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor of his office. "What happened? Is she... How did you get this number?" "Your wife, ex-wife, listed you as an emergency contact on the intake forms. Rosemary has been admitted with severe dehydration and a high fever. Ms. Bennett collapsed in our waiting room and is currently unconscious. We need someone here immediately." Ethan was already grabbing his keys, his mind racing through 1,000 terrifying possibilities. "I'm on my way. Don't let anything happen to them." The drive to Seattle Children's Hospital passed in a blur of squealing tires and red lights he barely stopped for. Ethan's hands shook as he ran through the sterile corridors, following signs to the pediatric ward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. He found them in room 314. Rosie lay in a hospital crib that seemed enormous around her tiny frame, IV lines snaking from her small arms to machines that beeped with mechanical precision. But it was the sight of Isla that stopped him cold. She sat in a chair beside the crib, pale as paper, her honey-colored hair lank with sweat and exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loose on a frame that had grown too thin. She looked up when he entered, and he saw no anger in her expression, only bone-deep weariness and fear. "She won't stop crying for you," Isla whispered, her voice hoarse. "The nurses say she keeps reaching toward the door like she's waiting for someone." Ethan approached slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile peace between them. Rosie's eyes tracked his movement, and when she saw him, she let out a weak cry that sounded remarkably like, "Dada." "How long has she been sick?" He kept his voice low, professional, but his hands were trembling as he reached toward the crib. 3 days. "I thought it was just a cold, but her fever spiked this morning and she couldn't keep anything down." Isla's voice cracked. "I carried her here on 2 buses because I couldn't afford a taxi, and somewhere between the waiting room and triage I just collapsed." Ethan's jaw clenched as he imagined Isla struggling alone with a sick baby, too proud to call him, too stubborn to accept help. "The doctor said you listed me as an emergency contact." I panicked. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "They needed a name. And you're her." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Father." Ethan completed it for her, the word feeling strange and wonderful and terrifying on his tongue. "I'm her father." For the first time since their confrontation in his office, Isla didn't argue. The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who looked between Ethan and Isla with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every family dynamic imaginable. "Rosemary is responding well to the IV fluids," Dr. Mills explained. "The fever is breaking, and her hydration levels are improving. She should be able to go home tomorrow, but she'll need careful monitoring for the next few days." "I can handle it," Isla said quickly, struggling to stand. The movement made her sway dangerously, and Ethan instinctively reached out to steady her. "Ms. Bennett," the doctor said gently, "you're in no condition to care for anyone right now. When was the last time you ate a full meal? Isla's silence was answer enough. You need rest, proper nutrition, and someone to help with Rosemary's care. Dr. Mills looked pointedly at Ethan. I assume that's why you called her father? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan looked at Isla, really looked at her, and saw past the stubborn pride to the exhausted woman who'd been carrying the weight of parenthood alone for almost a year. She was drowning, and her pride was the anchor dragging her under. She'll stay with me, Ethan said quietly. Both of them, until Isla is back on her feet. Ethan, no. Isla's protest was automatic, but weak. We can't, I won't. You won't what? Let me help my daughter when she's sick? Let me take care of the woman who's been taking care of her all this time? He moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears. Isla, you're falling apart. When was the last time you slept through the night? When was the last time someone took care of you? Tears spilled over her cheeks, the first real tears he'd seen from her since the divorce. I can handle this alone. I know you can. Ethan's voice was infinitely gentle. You've been proving it for 11 months, but you don't have to anymore. Rosie chose that moment to reach through the crib bars toward Ethan, her small hand grasping for his finger. When he gave it to her, she gripped it with surprising strength, her fever-bright eyes focusing on his face with intense concentration. Dada, she said clearly, the word cutting through every defense Isla had built around her heart. Dr. Mills smiled. I think that settles it. I'll have the discharge papers ready for tomorrow morning. As the doctor left, Ethan found himself holding his daughter's hand through the hospital crib bars, while her mother cried quietly in the chair beside them. It wasn't how he'd imagined meeting his child, but as Rosie's breathing evened out into peaceful sleep, her tiny fingers still wrapped around his, Ethan realized that some beginnings came disguised as emergencies. She said her first word to you, Isla whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Her second word, Ethan corrected gently. You told me her first word was mama. Isla looked up at him, surprise flickering across her tear-stained face. You remember that? I remember everything you've ever told me about her. He met her eyes, letting her see the truth there. I just wasn't ready to hear it before. Outside the hospital window, Seattle's skyline glittered in the gathering dusk, but Ethan's attention was focused entirely on the two females who had just let him back into their world, not through grand gestures or anonymous gifts, but through the simple, terrifying trust of a sick child reaching for her father's hand. The Queen Anne Hill mansion felt like stepping back in time, except everything had changed. Isla stood in the marble foyer she'd once called home, holding a sleepy Rosie while Ethan carried their hospital bags, and marveled at how foreign it all felt. The abstract paintings she'd chosen still hung on the walls. The Italian leather furniture she'd selected still dominated the living room, but the house felt hollow, like a museum of their failed marriage. The guest room is ready, Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral as he set their bags down. I had my housekeeper stock it with everything the hospital said Rosie would need. Isla followed him upstairs, noting that he'd avoided the master bedroom entirely, leading her instead to the spacious guest suite at the opposite end of the hallway. It had been transformed into something she barely recognized, a crib positioned near the window, baby monitors on the nightstand, and what appeared to be every infant care item available at Seattle's most expensive baby store. You didn't have to do all this, she said quietly, settling Rosie in the crib. Their daughter immediately began to fuss, reaching back toward Ethan with that same gesture that had undone them both at the hospital. She wants you to hold her, Isla observed, stepping back to give him space. Ethan approached the crib hesitantly, as if Rosie might disappear if he moved too quickly. When he lifted her, she immediately settled against his chest, her small hand fisting in his shirt. The sight hit Isla like a physical blow. Her daughter, so completely trusting in the arms of the man who'd missed her entire first year of life. She's so light, Ethan murmured, his voice thick with wonder. I thought babies would be heavier. She's small for her age. Isla settled into the plush armchair, exhaustion pulling at her bones. The pediatrician says she'll catch up, but the first few months were challenging. The understatement hung between them. Isla remembered those sleepless nights when Rosie wouldn't stop crying, when formula was too expensive and her milk supply was inconsistent from stress and poor nutrition. She remembered walking the floors of her tiny apartment at 3 a.m., bouncing a screaming baby while fighting off panic attacks about how she was going to make it through another day. Tell me, Ethan said, settling into the chair across from her without releasing Rosie. Tell me about those first few months. Ethan, please. His dark eyes met hers, and she saw something there she'd never seen during their marriage. Genuine vulnerability. I need to know what I missed. I need to understand what you went through alone. So she told him. About the labor that lasted 18 hours with no one to hold her hand or tell her she was strong enough to get through it. About bringing Rosie home to an apartment that felt too quiet and too overwhelming all at once. About the night she'd called the pediatric nurse hotline at 2 a.m. because she was convinced something was wrong when Rosie wouldn't stop crying, only to learn that sometimes babies just cried. I kept a journal, she found herself admitting. Pictures, milestones, funny things she did. I told myself it was for her so she'd know about her first year, but really, I think I was keeping it for you. Ethan's breathing hitched. Where is it? In my apartment, hidden in the closet. Isla watched as he swayed gently, Rosie's eyes growing heavy in his arms. I thought maybe someday if you ever wanted to know her, you'd want to see what you missed. I want to see it. The words came out hoarse. All of it. Every photo, every milestone, every moment I should have been there for. They fell into silence, the weight of lost time settling around them like dust. Rosie had fallen asleep against Ethan's chest, her tiny hand still clutching his shirt, and Isla felt something she'd thought was permanently broken beginning to stir back to life in her chest. She looks like you when she sleeps, Isla said softly. Peaceful, like nothing in the world could touch her. She has your chin. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might wake their daughter. And your stubbornness. The nurse said she refused to take the medicine until they brought you back to consciousness. The mention of her collapse brought reality crashing back. Isla touched her temple, where a headache had been building since she'd woken up in the hospital. The doctor said I need to eat more, rest more. Easier said than done when you're living paycheck to paycheck. That stops now. Ethan's voice carried a note of finality that reminded her why he'd become a billionaire before his 35th birthday. You don't go back to that apartment. You don't go back to selling flowers on street corners. You focus on getting healthy, and you let me take care of both of you. Ethan, we can't. Why not? He stood carefully, moving toward the crib to put Rosie down. Give me one good reason why the mother of my child should be struggling to afford groceries while I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Because money doesn't fix everything. The words exploded from her with more force than she'd intended. Rosie stirred in the crib and both parents immediately froze, waiting to see if she'd wake up. When their daughter settled back into sleep, Isla continued in a whisper. Money doesn't fix the fact that you chose your company over our marriage. It doesn't fix the fact that you made me feel like wanting children was selfish and demanding. It doesn't fix the fact that you let me walk away without fighting for us. You're right. Ethan's admission surprised them both. Money doesn't fix any of that. But maybe time can. Maybe proving that I've learned from those mistakes can. People don't change, Ethan. Not really. Then explain this. He gestured around the transformed room. Explain why I canceled 5 board meetings to sit in a hospital room. Explain why I haven't thought about a single business deal since the moment I saw you again. Guilt, not guilt. He moved closer, his voice dropping to that intimate tone she remembered from their early dating days. Love. I never stopped loving you, Isla. I just convinced myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. I was wrong about that too. The confession hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Outside the window, Seattle's lights twinkled in the distance, and Isla could hear the familiar sound of rain beginning to fall against the glass. I kept our wedding album, she whispered. The admission pulled from somewhere deep inside her. Even after everything, even when I hated you, I couldn't throw it away. Ethan's breath caught. Isla, I'm not saying I forgive you. Her voice was firm despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I'm not saying this changes anything between us. But for Rosie's sake, I'll stay until I'm back on my feet and she's fully recovered. And then, Isla looked at their daughter sleeping peacefully in the crib that should have been hers from the beginning, then back at the man who'd broken her heart so thoroughly she'd thought it would never heal. Then we figure out how to be parents together, even if we can't be anything else. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a second chance. But as Ethan's eyes closed in what looked like relief, Isla realized it might be something even more important. It was hope. 6 days in the Queen Anne mansion had created a routine that felt dangerously close to normal. Ethan worked from his home office while Isla recovered her strength, emerging every few hours to check on Rosie or bring Isla meals that his housekeeper prepared. They moved around each other with careful politeness, co-parenting in shifts like diplomats from warring nations who'd declared a temporary ceasefire. It was working too well. and that terrified Isla more than their previous animosity had. On Thursday morning, while Ethan was in a video conference and Rosie napped peacefully in her crib, Isla found herself in his study. The journal lay open on his desk, the one she'd retrieved from her apartment the day before, filled with a year's worth of moments he'd missed. Photos of Rosie's first smile, notes about her sleep patterns, pressed flowers from the day they'd spent in Volunteer Park when spring arrived. She took her first steps 2 weeks ago, Isla said softly, not turning around when she heard him enter. Ethan approached slowly, stopping just behind her chair. Where? Mrs. Chen's apartment. She let go of the coffee table and walked 3 steps to reach a cookie. Isla turned the page, revealing a blurry photo she'd managed to capture on her phone. She looked so proud of herself. I should have been there. His voice was thick with regret. Yes, you should have. Isla closed the journal and finally faced him. But you weren't, and we survived without you. We were happy, Ethan. Not the kind of happiness that comes from having everything you want, but the kind that comes from appreciating what you have. Ethan sat heavily in the chair across from his desk, looking older than his 36 years. What are you trying to tell me? I'm trying to tell you that we don't need your guilt or your mansion or your money to be a family. Isla stood, moving to the window that overlooked the manicured gardens she'd once planned to fill with children's laughter. Rosie and I, we're already complete. Then why does it feel like something's missing every time I look at the two of you together? The question hit her like a physical blow. Isla pressed her forehead against the cool glass, watching the morning mist roll off Elliott Bay. Because you want to rewrite history. You want to pretend that the last 20 months didn't happen? That you can just step into our lives and suddenly become the father and husband you never were? That's not what I want. Ethan's voice was closer now, though she hadn't heard him move. I want to earn my place in her life, in your life. I want to prove that I've learned from my mistakes. And then what? Isla spun around, and he was closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. What happens when the novelty wears off? When being a father becomes inconvenient? When your board members start pressuring you to choose between your family and your empire again? That won't happen. You can't promise that. Her voice broke on the words. You can't promise that you won't hurt us again, and I can't risk letting Rosie fall in love with a father who might disappear the moment things get difficult. They stood there in the morning light, 20 months of pain and love and regret swirling between them like a storm neither knew how to navigate. Through the baby monitor on his desk, they could hear Rosie beginning to stir, making the soft sounds that meant she'd be fully awake soon. I sold it, Ethan said suddenly. Isla blinked. Sold what? Lockhart Automotive, the whole company. I signed the papers yesterday. His voice was steady, but she could see his hands trembling slightly. Garrett Industries made an offer 6 months ago that I rejected because I couldn't imagine my life without the company. Yesterday, I couldn't imagine my life without you and Rosie Moore. The words hit her like ice water. Ethan, you can't. That company is your life's work. No. He stepped closer, his voice gaining strength. You were my life's work. You and Rosie. I was just too blind and too terrified to see it. You're going to regret this. Isla shook her head, panic rising in her chest. In 6 months or a year, you're going to wake up and realize you gave up everything for a woman who can't even forgive you, and a daughter who barely knows you. You want to know what I'll regret? Ethan's voice rose. Months of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. I'll regret not being there when you found out you were pregnant. I'll regret not holding your hand during labor. I'll regret missing Rosie's first word, her first step, her first everything. I'll regret every night you spent alone wondering if you were strong enough to be a single mother. Tears were streaming down Isla's face now. 20 months of held-back grief and exhaustion, and desperate love finally breaking through her carefully constructed walls. But you know what I won't regret? Ethan continued, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. I won't regret choosing my family over profit margins. I won't regret putting my daughter's future over stock options. I won't regret fighting for the woman I love instead of hiding behind conference room tables and quarterly reports. Through the monitor, Rosie's babbling grew more insistent. In a few minutes, she'd be crying for attention, and this moment, whatever this moment was becoming, would be interrupted by the reality of parenthood. I'm scared, Isla whispered, the admission torn from her deepest fears. I'm scared to believe you. I'm scared to let Rosie love you, and then lose you again. I'm scared that I'm not strong enough to survive if you change your mind. Then don't. Ethan reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. Don't be strong. Don't carry everything alone. Let me share the weight. Let me prove that some people really can change when they have something worth changing for. Rosie's cries echoed through the monitor, urgent now, demanding attention from her parents. But neither of them moved, caught in a moment that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff deciding whether to jump or step back onto solid ground. If I say yes, Isla said slowly, if I give us another chance, this isn't about the money or the house or trying to recreate what we had before. This is about building something new, something real. I know. And if you ever make me feel like loving you is a burden again, if you ever make Rosie feel like she's competing with your ambition for your attention, I will take her and disappear so completely that all your money and all your investigators will never find us. The threat should have intimidated him. Instead, Ethan smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since their reunion, and lifted her hands to his lips. Deal, he whispered against her fingers. But Isla, you won't need to disappear, because I'm never letting either of you go again. Rosie's cries reached a crescendo, and finally, together, they went to comfort their daughter. Not as ex-spouses sharing custody, not as reluctant co-parents, but as something they'd never been before. A family choosing each other one day at a time. 2 years later, the morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of their Ballard home. Not the Queen Anne mansion that had felt like a museum, but a warm, lived-in house with finger smudges on the glass doors and crayon marks on the lower walls. Isla stood at the counter, watching through the window as Ethan pushed 3-year-old Rosie on the tire swing he'd hung from the old oak tree in their backyard. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" Rosie's delighted squeals carried through the open window, and Isla smiled as she watched her husband again, as of 6 months ago, pretend to struggle with the rope. "I don't know, sweetheart," Ethan called back, his voice filled with exaggerated concern. "Any higher and you might fly away like a bird." "I want to fly," Rosie giggled, her dark curls streaming behind her like ribbons. "Catch me if I fly, Daddy." "Always," Ethan promised, and Isla's heart clenched at the absolute certainty in his voice. The past 2 years hadn't been a fairy tale. There had been arguments about boundaries, discussions about the future that lasted until 3 a.m., and moments when old fears crept in to whisper that happiness this profound couldn't possibly last. But they'd worked through each challenge together, learning to communicate in ways they'd never managed during their first marriage. Ethan had used the money from selling Lockhart Automotive to start a foundation focused on single-parent support, housing assistance, childcare funding, and job training programs. He worked from their home office 3 days a week and spent the other 2 at the foundation, but he'd never missed a bedtime story or a scraped knee that needed kissing better. The front door opened, and Mrs. Chen shuffled in carrying a container of what were undoubtedly homemade dumplings. At 78, she'd appointed herself honorary grandmother to Rosie, and had a standing invitation to Sunday dinner that she'd never missed. "That child gets more spoiled every week," Mrs. Chen said fondly, watching through the window as Ethan now lay on the grass while Rosie used his back as a launching pad for somersaults. "She's got him wrapped around her little finger," Isla agreed, though her tone carried nothing but affection. "And you? Still happy with your choice?" It was a question Mrs. Chen asked every few months, not from doubt, but from the protective instincts of someone who'd watched Isla struggle through those early months of single motherhood. Isla considered it seriously, as she always did. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, using the answer that had become their ritual. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Smart girl. Happiness isn't something you achieve once and keep forever. It's something you choose day by day." Through the window they watched as Ethan scooped Rosie up and spun her around, both of them laughing with the kind of unself-conscious joy that made Isla's chest tight with gratitude. When he set her down, Rosie immediately pointed toward the house. "Mama, Mama, did you see me fly?" Isla opened the back door as her daughter came barreling toward her, grass stains on her knees, and pure happiness radiating from every part of her small body. "I saw everything, baby girl. You were amazing." Ethan followed more slowly, his hair mussed and his business shirt wrinkled from their morning adventures. He looked nothing like the polished billionaire she'd first married, and everything like the man she'd fallen in love with all over again. "Mrs. Chen brought dumplings," Isla told him as he approached. "Perfect. I worked up an appetite being a human jungle gym." He dropped a kiss on the top of Isla's head, casual and natural in a way that had taken months to rebuild. "How's the morning sickness today?" Isla placed a protective hand over her still flat stomach where their second child, a son, according to last week's ultrasound, was growing steadily. "Better. I think Junior approves of Mrs. Chen's cooking." Junior? Rosie looked up from where she was collecting dandelions near the porch steps. Who's Junior? Ethan and Isla exchanged a look, having discussed how to tell their daughter about the pregnancy, but never quite finding the right moment. Apparently, the right moment was now, in the middle of their backyard on a Sunday morning, surrounded by the ordinary magic of their everyday life. Come here, sweetheart, Isla said, settling onto the porch steps and pulling Rosie onto her lap. Mommy and Daddy have something exciting to tell you. As they explained about the baby brother who would arrive in 6 months, Isla caught Ethan's eye over their daughter's head. He was watching them with an expression she'd grown to treasure. Complete present moment awareness, as if this conversation with their 3-year-old was the most important meeting of his life. Will he like tire swings? Rosie asked seriously. Probably, Ethan said, settling beside them on the steps. But he'll have to wait until he's bigger. Babies are very small when they're first born. Smaller than me? Much smaller. Rosie considered this gravely. Then I'll help take care of him, like Daddy takes care of me. Exactly like that, Isla whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Later that evening, after Mrs. Chen had gone home with promises to bring soup for Isla's pregnancy symptoms, after Rosie had been tucked into bed with 3 stories and a dozen kisses, Ethan and Isla sat on their front porch swing, watching the Seattle skyline twinkle in the distance. Do you ever miss it? Isla asked quietly. The company, the deals, the rush of closing a billion-dollar acquisition. Ethan was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, contemplative. I miss the simplicity of it sometimes, he admitted, when success could be measured in numbers and problems could be solved with money. But I don't miss feeling empty at the end of every day, no matter how successful that day had been. And now I know what it feels like to come home to people who are happy to see me. Not because of what I can provide, but because of who I am to them. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. Now I know what it means to build something that can't be bought or sold or lost in a market crash. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through the trees. Somewhere in the house behind them, Rosie was probably dreaming of flying and tire swings and the baby brother who would soon join their small, perfect family. I love you, Isla said into the peaceful darkness. I love you too. Ethan's voice carried all the weight of second chances and hard-won wisdom. Thank you for letting me learn how to be the man you deserved all along. Thank you for becoming him. As they sat together on the porch of their imperfect, beautiful life, Isla realized that Mrs. Chen had been right. Happiness wasn't something you achieved once and kept forever. It was something you chose, day by day, moment by moment, swing by swing. And tomorrow, she would choose it again. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding the perfect person. They're about 2 imperfect people choosing to grow into the love they both deserve. In a world where second chances are rare and forgiveness is earned, not given, what would you choose? The safety of protecting your heart, or the courage to risk everything for the possibility of building something beautiful from the broken pieces? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below, letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.